Next, let's talk about production and then enterprises. So production is the process of converting inputs into outputs. This is often done by producers or firms. And essentially what they're doing is they're turning costs into revenue. They're taking costs, which would be what they're paying for their inputs, and they're turning that inputs into a consumable good, a usable output. And by them turning that into an output and selling that output, they're obtaining revenue from it. So they're essentially taking the costs of that input, converting them into an output that they can sell, and then turning those costs into revenues. And essentially the idea of a business or a producer or a firm is to take that input, the cost of that input, turn it into an output and earn a higher revenue on the output than on the cost. And what we often see is that these inputs are often intermediate goods. They're often taking not necessarily just raw goods, but you might take a raw good and turn it into an intermediate good. And then another firm will take that intermediate good and turn it into, say, a final good. And an intermediate good is a good that's not going back to final consumption. It's going to be used again in another production process. So we often find that firms are using intermediate goods in their inputs. So an example of that might be a car manufacturer. A car manufacturer's inputs are a lot of car parts. So they're taking those car parts, and those car parts are intermediate goods, because those car parts are actually produced by another production facility that took, say, raw steel and raw goods and turned it into car parts, making that an intermediate good that was later be sold and used in a manufacturing of a final good, which would be the final car. So what we often see is that these inputs usually account for intermediate goods. And then the next thing I'd like to talk about is an enterprise. An enterprise would be a single production activity within a firm, a single economic production activity. So a single firm usually has or can often have multiple enterprises. So let's look at just a farmer or a rancher. Let's say you have a rancher that produces alfalfa hay, corn, and then also cattle. Well, the cattle would be an enterprise because that's a single production activity. The alfalfa would be an enterprise, and then the corn would be an enterprise. And the reason for that is that cattle is a single production activity. So we often take these enterprises and break them down onto an enterprise by enterprise basis to where we're looking at, say, just the cattle enterprise. And that allows us to see whether or not we are making or losing money on cattle. And then we'll keep that separate from, say, the alfalfa enterprise to where we can see if they are making money by producing alfalfa. That often allows us to see maybe some pitfalls in our business model. Let's say, for example, you're actually producing cattle and alfalfa together, but you're not keeping them separate. You don't really have it separated into two different enterprises or two different enterprise budgets. So let's say as a whole, you're making money off of that whole operation. But what if we broke it down to enterprise budget? And we say, all right, we have our cattle information over here, and let's see, okay, we're profitable on the cattle. But what if we broke it down and we looked at, say, the alfalfa, and we figured out that we're actually losing money on alfalfa, and it would be cheaper just to buy the alfalfa rather than to produce it? Well, that can allow some economic pitfalls or business pitfalls and allow us to really evaluate is what we're doing the right thing. So what an enterprise is basically a single production activity within a firm. And that single production activity would be producing one single good. If you're looking at a cow-calf operation, it would be producing calves. If you're looking at producing alfalfa, it would be producing alfalfa. But an enterprise would not be producing hay and alfalfa. You would actually producing cattle and alfalfa. You would separate those two out.